Senator Lole-Taylor.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on behalf of New Zealand First, while at the same time I'm trying to find a good reason to agree with that member's speech. I believe that former Speaker is rather confused about which bill that is being discussed right now, nor aware of what is being said. In fact, the former Speaker reminds me of the lyrics of an Irish song that goes something like, "For all the languages we cannot communicate. For all the languages we cannot communicate." There seems to be no clear communication from the government, nor are they able to say anything that will provide any of our senior residents at residential homes any comfort. And strange to tell, among that national earthen lot, some of us over this side of the House can articulate, while they cannot, clearly cannot. I thought it was strange, very strange, to hear the Minister said that she can see this bill as a fair bill. Mr. Speaker, for years, our citizens who should be cared for fairly is the word, at residential care, have been demanded to complete forms by government's department. The form said if they need long-term residential care in hospitals, they need to complete these forms. There is also another demand that asks them, and it goes like this, if I can quote, "You may be able to get a residential care subsidy from the Ministry of Health." Note the word may, only three-letter word may. Why is that? Because the Ministry of Health determines if the person may get a residential care subsidy. Our senior citizens may get a residential care subsidy if they are assessed as needing long-term residential care in a hospital. It also depends on how much he earns and the spouses. Mr. Speaker, these residents have spent many years of their lives serving this country. Pesata Lotui Inga would not understand that. Mr. Speaker, these residents have spent many years of their lives contributing and building the economy of this country. Somebody tells that to Pesata Lotui Inga. Mr. Speaker, these residents have spent many years of their lives fought hard to ensure that people like those members over there on that side of the House have a better future. They have worked really hard to provide for a brighter future and healthier environment for all New Zealanders, not just for the few wealthy friends of the national government. Sadly, the government has failed to take that into account. Instead, the response they have is always I. I becomes the only vocabulary of that side of the House in an everyday language. I. Leaving common sense outside of the Parliament altogether. Mr. Speaker, the Minister who introduced this bill is obviously confused what planet she's on. Given that her welfare destruction bill says yes to some sort of youth training and no to sensible New Zealand First policies that create jobs. The bill strikes the heart of our elderly citizens by determining that their assets should be used to pay the cost of their contracted care services. Instead, they just respond, I do anything and everything. And I am reminded of an old saying, the ball no question makes of ayes and noes, but right or left as strikes the player goes. And she that tossed, thee See that toss thee down into the field. She knows about it all. She knows. She knows. Mr. Speaker, how naive of this government to quickly forget about many years of service and positive contribution. This government needs to wake up and start introducing some better solutions. These welfare reforms will have skilled Kiwis packing their bags to Australia or reduced to student wages. While we are on the exodus path, we might as well send our elderly off with them. At least in Australia, they may have a better hope of holding onto their assets. Has anyone thought of the effects that this new budget measure will have on low-income families? Alfred Ngaro will forget that. Oh yes, they will be forced to provide for the care of their parents and grandparents. They cannot sit there and complain that the Pacific people are the high statistics on the unemployment scale when they are forcing them to stay home to look after their elderly because they simply can't afford to have them placed in care. I know this for sure. They can't afford to go to work because they have to stay home and look after their papas and mamas from Cook Islands, their Tama and their Tinama from Samoa. I know that those national small-minded will say, well, these people don't have any assets, so they won't be affected. Well, this budget measure is surely going to say to these people, don't bother with attaining assets. That's what this bill is all about. In 2010, 19,000 depending on the residential subsidy. This rate is likely to drop dramatically. What are you saying to the children of New Zealand is don't bother having savings, don't bother having assets, don't bother with a bright future, because this will mean absolutely nothing when you are older. That's what this bill is all about. Don't bother having assets that are worth more than $213,000. Have you seen the prices of houses in Auckland, especially in Manukau? The average price of houses in Manukau, just in case that Alfred Ngaro has forgotten, it is $345,000 in South Auckland. As we get closer to Central and East Auckland, this price increases to $800,000. $800,000. I'm sure Housing New Zealand will be grinning with glee to these facts because there will be an increase in people renting their homes after hearing a threshold that will be so low they can't even buy a parking slot in the city. National will come back with the argument that the family of these elderly can live in their houses or younger spouses so that they are not affected by the threshold. This zero budget, or zero initiative, we might as well call it, is dependent on volatility. You have decided, sorry, Mr. Speaker, the government has decided to base a job market on Christchurch. Well, let's face it, we're not even sure whether that is going to happen, but it's going to bounce back. And now the government will base how the elderly will be cared for on a CPI rate of 2.1. 2.1. I have a constituent, a couple, who are reaching the age of retirement and have saved up in order to buy the state house that they've been living in for a number of years. Yes, they have. They were informed in April by the Housing New Zealand that they can actually buy this property. And then, that was last year. And then this year they were told that the offer has been withdrawn. Now I suspect that Housing New Zealand knew that these people and those in similar age bracket situations were best not to buy their houses because of the budget announcement yesterday. So what are we left with? And what are they left with? Well, no assets to pass on to future generations just so that they can have a subsidy to allow them to stay at rest home. The reality is that rest homes can come pretty close to eating up a person's entire wealth. We do not support this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Tim McIndoe.